Thanks for tuning in. I'd just like to give a trigger warning before you continue on listening with the episode. There will be themes of suicide, self-harm, and emotional distress. If anything in the show brings up heavy emotions, please see the link in our bio and on our website. Stay safe. It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Stigma is a Greek word that once referred to a tattoo that was cut or burnt into the skin of criminals and slaves in order to visibly identify them as damaged or morally polluted persons. These individuals were to be avoided, particularly in public places. Today, people living with mental health conditions can experience stigma unfairly. We may be treated as dangerous, different, or as if we are somehow less than other people. Our expert today, Fay Jackson, knows about stigma. Fay has been a pioneer in the peer support movement in New South Wales and Australia. Fay is a multi-award winning national motivational speaker, educator, advocate and voice for mental health. Fay was appointed as the inaugural Deputy Commissioner of New South Wales Mental Health Commission and is the General Manager of Inclusion with Flourish Australia. Fay is proud to be a person with lived experience of mental health issues. She refers to herself as a psychologically diverse citizen, or PDC. She also refers to people without mental health issues as psychologically ordinary citizens, or POCs. Fay, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And my first question is, why is mental illness stigmatised?
Okay, so there's two things there. Mental health issues are stigmatised. I think that your original meaning of stigma there is more fitting with how people are treated nowadays. But I think the word stigma is used nowadays is a really light touch to what is actually discrimination.
Yeah.
So I prefer to actually call it the way it is experienced nowadays, and it is discrimination usually. As far as it being illness, that's another discussion too, because I actually don't think that what we experience is illness. I used to think it was, but now for all of the research that I've read, experiences, discussions with people with lived experience in Australia, across Australia and in other countries as well, I now think that, and more doctors are starting to say this, that it is a normal response to trauma, in the gamut of normal responses to trauma rather than illness. Now, with illnesses and disease, you can usually take blood samples to prove that it's there, or x-rays or whatever, but there isn't anything to prove that.
Illness is a medicalised term.
That's right. It's medicalised, a normal response to trauma. Sometimes very distressing and very difficult to handle responses to trauma, but still within a normal response. I mean, deep grief when you've lost somebody that you really love is really distressing and hard to handle, but it's still normal response to grief.
What would a better term be? I use mental distress quite a bit.
People use different terms, mental distress, psychological distress, mental health challenges. It's different. For some people, it does suit them to use the term mental illness. And if it makes their experience easier for them to handle, so long as the person has the opportunity to choose for themselves what it is that they term it, Generally speaking, we have the term mental illness thrust upon us.
Yeah.
And very often the next thing that's thrust upon us is the medical system and the loss of our human rights.
It seems a lot of people report that some of the most significant stigma and discrimination they experience is actually within the medical system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that true from your perspective?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Being a person who has used or been forcefully put into services, that's very strong.
Yeah.
That stigma and discrimination is in there. My first job was at the age of 40 as a peer worker in public mental health service in psychiatric wards. And then I became a manager of peer workers, and then I became a director of that service. And what I found then was that I did some research on how my time was spent, and 27% of my time was spent in supporting nurses and other clinical staff who had lived experience but were so fearful of being found out because of the way they would be treated.
Absolutely.
So that tells you what the attitude is towards people with lived experience of mental health issues. That's what it's like towards their staff, let alone people who may seem to be what other people would term as mad or crazy. Doctors have said things to me like, what's the world coming to? This is the mad leading the mad. So there's certainly very strong stigma and discrimination inside services, and that must change. That must change for everybody's sake.
And the way I figure it, 40% of people on the planet will experience some sort of mental distress in their life. Therefore, 40% of workers in the world are actually peer workers.
I would say that they have lived experience, you know.
Yes.
But being a peer worker is a very different way of working. You can be a nurse with lived experience or a doctor with lived experience, social worker. I would love them to have lived experience because they're going to relate a lot better to me. But they are different to peer workers. So I wouldn't like to get those two mixed up. A doctor or a nurse has a choice to utilise their lived experience when they're having conversations with people or in their work. Whereas a peer worker, it's a requirement of them to use their lived experience to build relationships, to build understanding, break down barriers, break down discrimination and stigma.
And what are some of the barriers and discrimination that need to be challenged?
The idea that people with lived experience aren't strong and aren't capable. In fact, if people who didn't have lived experience had the kinds of things that we deal with thrust upon them, they may find it very difficult to deal with. But in fact, those of us who've had lived experience for a considerable amount of time really learn a lot about how to be resilient and how to relate to other people. Traditionally, the idea that being vulnerable or fragile is seen as a weakness. But if you actually use your vulnerability purposefully to build a relationship and rapport with someone, then it's a real strength. So a really easy way to understand that is if a mother has a newborn baby and she's feeling really vulnerable and she talks to another mother who has a 6-month-old who's been through the difficult, very early weeks, then in the sharing of that, there's an understanding and a connection that can be built that isn't built unless somebody else has been through it before.
One of the interesting things that happened last year for me and for a lot of friends, fellow passengers, I call other people who've lived with mental distress, is that the skills and resources we've built up in our lives, when 2020 happened and lockdown happened, I kind of found it smooth sailing. Being in lockdown compared to being in catatonic depression felt like part golf. And it was a lot of my friends who had never experienced significant distress were losing it. And anecdotal evidence from a lot of emergency departments now and a lot of local health districts suggests this might be true. And I can't wait for the research to come out that shows that we have superpowers. We have superpowers.
That's right. I'm really excited about that. I was in the service that I work for, I was saying, you know, at the very beginning of the lockdowns and everything, it was all doom and gloom, you know, people are going to be suiciding, people with mental health issues are going to be worse, blah, blah, blah. Don't buy into that rhetoric of it's all doom and gloom. You've been isolated before. You've been shut off from people. You've found it hard to communicate. You haven't been able to go out. You might have been forcibly locked down or too anxious to go out. Draw on those skills that you've already learned through that. And they did very well. And that's the kind of feedback that we're getting too. The people that we support who have a lived experience, actually most of them managed it quite well.
Yeah.
It was certainly distressing for some people, absolutely. But compared to people who hadn't experienced lived experience and had learned the resilient ways of coping with that, it was much harder.
Tell me, how has stigma affected you?
Well, really directly. When I was young, called crazy and lunatic. And when people talk about they'd love to go back to their teenage years, I just think, wow, that's a whole nother planet to where I was on. You know, there's no way I want to go back to that.
No.
So I was really ostracised in my teenage years. And then it was difficult through my adult years because I grew up in country. People, you know, if people know that they've given you the label of crazy, it's really hard to get employment or anything. When I started going public, and so I was the first lived experience speaker for Beyond Blue to raise awareness of mental health issues and what people need. And we started running public forums. So my family and I decided that I wouldn't do it in my local area. So I kept travelling out of the area to do it. Then came the time when my girls had left school and had left home. And we decided as a family that it would be okay for me to go public in the local area with one of those forums. At that stage, I was doing casual teaching and I had a whole year booked in for casual teaching. I went public at the forum on one night. The next morning, I received a phone call to say that there had been a mistake, that there'd been double booking and I was no longer needed. And actually that was the last time I had been asked to be a casual teacher for the department, for any school. So it's a really direct example.
How do you think POCs, psychologically ordinary citizens, how could they be better allies for us?
By recognising our strengths and our capabilities, by not assuming that we're incapable or we're fragile in the negative sense or we're weak in the negative sense, always fighting for our human rights. The public mental health system in every state in Australia works against the International Convention on Human Rights. Whenever a person is put into hospital against their will or treated against their will or in hospital put into seclusion and restraint, that's not within keeping of the International Convention on Human Rights or disability rights. And a lot of people don't recognise that. Because it's the law doesn't mean it's justice.
What would you say to someone who's struggling with stigma, who's been through some of the stuff you've been through, experiencing their own stigma and shame based on a diagnosis or what other people say about them? What would you say to them?
You know, I think a part of not discriminating or stigmatising yourself is to have self-confidence. But I think that a lot of it, in spite of what has happened to us and how we've responded to that, but I think a very large percentage of us with lived experience find it almost impossible to have self-confidence. So I always encourage people to have self-compassion. What would they say to their best friend or to somebody that they really love who has been through what they've been through? And almost inevitably, a person has been through trauma. That's the root cause of the mental health issue. To say to themselves the same things that they would say to someone that they love who's been through that kind of trauma and whose mind and body are responding to that trauma in the way it is. So self-compassion can really help you, stop stigmatising against yourself. Then I would say look for your strengths. When you're in a bad way, you may not be able to find your strengths. When you're really down, when you're really depressed, really anxious, when the voices are hammering hard at you, you may find it really hard to find your strengths. It is a good idea then to turn to people, particularly people who have gone through those hard times, to help you find your strengths and to write them down, because you won't probably remember them, but to write them down and to keep going back over that. We now know, science has now proven that neuroplasticity, or the ability to change the way your brain thinks, then changes the way you feel about things. So if we work on changing the way we think negatively about us and seeing ourselves as damaged or broken goods or crazy or mad or whatever, and if something isn't a problem in our minds, then it's not a problem.
Absolutely.
So I'm a member of the Mad Pride movement, And so I think that people with lived experience should really look up that movement and get involved in the Mad Pride movement. It's a wonderful thing to be involved in, and it celebrates difference and diversity in thinking. You know, we usually think about diversity being whether you're from a rainbow community or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, First Nations people. But diversity is also about diverse ways of thinking and diverse ways of feeling and responding to what happens. So although we may not feel resilient, if we're still alive, we are resilient.
Absolutely.
So you can start at that point at least. I'm alive, so I must be resilient. I may not feel it, but feelings aren't always facts.
Yeah.
And I do think about suicide a lot. I think people that have been through really severe trauma, it's very common for them to do that. But I now know that feelings aren't facts. And I don't have to rely on that thought that suicide is a good option, because it's not. It's never a good option. It's a final option, but it's not something that ever brings about anything other than that finality. And a lot of pain to your families. And we can falsely believe that our families and friends will be better off without us. I can tell you, in working in public and not-for-profit services, families and friends are never better off when somebody takes their life. It causes terrible damage.
They can inherit the significant mental distress that we've experienced too.
Yeah, look, I think that talking to other people that have lived experience and who are on their recovery journeys really helps. There's a Japanese craft called kintsugi, and it's where they take bowls or dishes or vases, whatever, that have been broken, and they mend them with liquid gold and put them back together, and they hold again with that liquid gold. But the gold is in the cracks. And the vessel is more valuable after it's been broken and mended than what it was before it was broken.
And it's much more beautiful.
Much more beautiful.
Absolutely.
And that's what my experience of people with lived experience are. You know, they may have been told that they're broken and cracked, or they might have felt like that because of the trauma that was forced upon them. But when they recover, even though they may still carry with them a feeling of fragility, and they still, if they can take those experiences and use them to connect with others and support others, use them in the service of others, it's a very, very beautiful thing.
Fay, in the work you have done, you have made me feel a little more magical and a little less broken. So I thank you for joining us, and I thank you on behalf of many people who have experienced mental distress, many of us magical people, and you've made the world a better place by being you and by doing you. Thank
you. But I think, you know, this idea of leadership, people see me as a leader. I actually think we should all claim our leadership. Everybody is a leader if they claim it, and if they try to make a difference in their own lives, a positive difference in their families or friends' lives, or anybody that they come in contact with, to break down all this stigma and discrimination and nonsense about mental health issues and lived experience, then they are leaders. So claim it, claim your lives back, claim your recovery, even if you still have symptoms. You just claim it and go on and live a contributing, positive, meaningful life. And you can do that, because I can, and I know thousands of others who are. So let's do it together.
Welcome to Club Mind. This is the part of the show where we get 3 people with lived mental health experience to have a chat and reflect on the interview that we just heard. We thought for the first episode, why not get the 3 producers behind It's a Minefield to be the first to start off the segment. We all have lived experience, and this is a way for you to get to know us and see that what we're doing comes from the heart, from the soul, and we know exactly what we're talking about. So strap in and get to know a little bit about us. My name is Caroline.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Leon. You would have heard me just interviewing the Fay Jackson.
Oh, that was so good.
She's pretty amazing, isn't she?
I got goosebumps a few times.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't know where to start dissecting it.
Go.
Okay, all right. At the forefront of my mind was the COVID. I really laughed about that because it's so true. You hear so many people saying, COVID 2020 was the hardest year of my life.
Yeah.
And as someone who has had so many years of terrible mental health experiences, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
That was the hardest year of your life? You couldn't go outside for a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. What did you think?
I mean, yeah, it was such a good interview. I thought, particularly when she was talking about stigma, the biggest thing that came up for me is self-stigma.
Yeah.
I think if you've been stigmatised by other people, then you kind of adopt those values as your own and you see yourself through that lens. And that's a really, really hard thing to come up against and to, like, I guess, fight against and try and get over.
That was absolutely my experience too, because when I went through a lot of mental distress, and especially when I received my diagnosis and what I call my words, and my words are bipolar type 2, whatever that means. And I would adopt a lot of that as therefore part of my personality. And as Fay said, I would have taken that on board and said, oh yes, so 2020 is going to be a really tough year for me because I'm designed that way. That's what way my brain chemistry and my personality work. And I prepared for the worst. And I, as you said, Kaz, I really got a lot out of the year too. So there was something about that self-stigma and about those expectations where I realised I had a superpower. I realised many of our peers, many of us have superpowers.
There was something that she mentioned, how if a regular person suddenly, developed a mental, I'm not, paraphrasing exactly.
That a POC, a psychologically ordinary
citizen. I'm so sorry.
Well, I sometimes call them muggles.
Muggles.
I like that.
People, the boring, the neurotypicals, they wouldn't be able to deal in the way that we do, that we can compartmentalise. And the first image that came to my head was like a glass of water, right? And everybody's got some water in their glass. But if you suffer with psychological distress on a daily basis, your glass is pretty much almost full all the time.
Yeah.
And things can make it overflow easily.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that your distress tolerance is low. Your distress tolerance is very high. It's just you're always distressed. That's
so true.
That's kind of what I was thinking, right? We don't have a lower distress tolerance. We're dealing with chronic high levels of distress. We are just human. And it gets to a point where it overflows.
Yes.
Right. So if somebody is dealing with a glass that's a quarter full and it gets to half full and they can't cope, well, I mean, look at us. Our glass is always full.
And we're coping every day.
That's so true. I never even thought of it that way.
Yeah.
It's not that we're not good at distress tolerance. We're actually excellent at distress tolerance. And people who perhaps found themselves in the position that we've maybe found ourselves in for many years of our lives in involuntary lockdown, my experience of catatonic depression, when they experienced that, their distress tolerance skills, which had never been practiced, suddenly got irritated and they realised or they felt really, really distressed. It's so interesting.
I feel like the glass of water analogy is really, really good. I find towards the end of the day, my glass is a little bit emptier and I can tolerate a little bit more. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not so crazy, maybe I'm not so anxious, maybe I'm actually functioning. And then when I sleep, it almost resets it. So I wake up and it's like this, oh fuck, like the glass is full. And then throughout the day, as like if a positive thing happens in the day or the day just kind of gets better, then the glass like shrinks a little bit and I've got a little bit more distress tolerance. But I wake up with the glass full every morning.
I'm actually the total opposite.
Yeah.
I put my normal person suit on, my neurotypical face mask and suit on, and I've got the most energy in the morning, but by the end of the day, I have been acting so normal and fitting into society and, walking around with this full glass, and by the end of the day, I'm depleted, and if I would just love to have a nap before I have to go out to dinner or something, just rejuvenate myself. So I'm actually the total opposite. My glass gets fuller throughout the day because that added layer of I don't even know how to not act normal. If I suddenly stopped acting normal, I don't even know what my What would I do? Oh, that's actually, I'm curious now.
I think I wake up every morning feeling very incapable, because that's how I feel at my core, is that I am incapable and that I will never be any better. So then as I go throughout the day, I do things and then I feel like, I am capable. I, helped this consumer at work, for example, or I had this conversation, or I passed this part of a job probation, or whatever it is. And that kind of helps the glass go down.
Wow.
But every morning I wake up feeling really, really incapable.
Chris, you're super capable.
Thanks.
You're
Super capable.
It's so interesting that experiences throughout the day alleviate your distress.
Yeah. I think it's I went through trauma of a car accident when I was 18.
Right.
And there was a long insurance legal case after it. But the basis of that was that I was incapable and I was only going to get worse. So that's what I took on as my own beliefs. And that has finalised. That part of my life is over in terms of it actually happening, but mentally it's still there.
Wow.
So mentally I wake up feeling really incapable, can't do anything.
So that's what you were told, and based on that prognosis, part of that you've kept as an identity.
Yeah, well, there was no hope for recovery, I guess. I was told by this lawyer who acted for me that things would only get worse, that I'd only work in very menial jobs, that I wouldn't be able to do X, Y, and Z uni degree, etc., etc., etc. So I took that on as something I strongly believe about myself. And I've done a couple of uni degrees. And I'm in a job that I love, but at the back of my mind, I'm always judging myself by that. So whatever I do, it's not good enough.
Self-stigma, hey?
Yeah, definitely.
You know what I see?
What?
Like what Fay said, that the broken porcelain. I just see all the gold in you.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Especially in that shine.
Feels like a therapy session.
Hopefully.
Which is what peer support is at its best,
absolutely.
Right? Did you find Fay inspiring in any way? What did you find inspiring about her?
Just the way that she spoke and the way that she described people living with, mental distress. I'm going to say mental. I like the term mental illness.
Yeah,
So
totally.
to me, I like to, not like to, but it's how I refer to it. So the way that she described the power and the magic of people with mental illness, I was like, I can do anything. I just want to jump up and go do something now. I'm amazing.
Yeah.
And I never feel that way. So she's got away with words that turn something that you're normally so insecure and self-stigmatizing into something that you actually just want to go out and yell on the street. I have a mental illness and I'm doing everything that you're doing.
And she lives it and she embodies it. She identifies as described her the way that she hears voices that other people aren't hearing, and she can still get about doing her job and do a really good job too. And her being her, she inspires me. She made the limits I placed on myself around my diagnosis and the things other people told me about me. She challenged that fundamentally, and it changed me.
Yeah. And you think about somebody might have had a fight with their spouse and they come to work and they're grumpy the whole day and they don't really perform very well. And you've got someone like Fay who is hearing these voices, is distressed, and is still doing an amazing job. And you just think I don't know, it is a superpower, right? Our distress tolerance is really, really high.
And I think another superpower mental illness can give you is an amount of empathy for people who might be experiencing their first episode of mental illness or mental unwellness. I think it gives you that empathy because you've been there before and you want to try and support your friends and loved ones through it. And there's a lot that they don't have to explain because you've been through it. Or you've been through something, it's not the same obviously because everyone's experience is different, but you've been through something similar. So they don't have to be okay around you.
Absolutely. I've experienced that a lot, where people know that there's certain crib notes they don't need to give me when they talk about stuff. And sometimes I'd find when I'm speaking with someone without lived experience, especially around suicide, if I'd ever need to disclose to someone that I just felt like killing myself that day, if people didn't have lived experience, I felt I had to coach them to receive the news that I was about to share with them. And that's true for a lot of mental illness or talk about mental distress. People with lived experience, you don't have to pre-coach. They know the crib notes first.
Have you ever told someone like, oh, I just don't feel like being alive today, I just want to kill myself? And they say, oh, but that's a cop-out. That's the coward's way out. Oh, yeah. I get that. Oh, I've got that. Yeah. Like that so many times. And it's like, no. And then you get into the coaching, but it's like sometimes you don't have the energy. So you just let it slide. But there are so many people walking around the planet thinking if you kill yourself, that's a cop-out. That was the weak thing to do. They have no concept of what brings someone to that place. And they also don't have the concept that a lot of people find the idea of suicide comforting when they've been in high levels of distress for a really long time. They also don't understand that when we do get to that point, we really, really do think people will be better off without us. It's not a selfish thing. It's the opposite of selfish. You just go through, I know, when I had my suicide attempt, I was just thinking, parents are going to be better off, friends are going to be better off, they're going to replace me at work with someone better. Like, I'm not going to have kids, so I don't have to continue this legacy and inflict any pain on my kids. Just end it here and everyone's going to be better off.
My beliefs are exactly the same thing. To me at the time, it was the ultimate act of selflessness. I was giving myself away because I was a massive burden to people. And that was my truth. That was my truth at the time. And people who say suicide is a selfish act, that's a very selfish thing to say. Those people have never lived in chronic pain, and they're very, very lucky people,
It's a privilege
to say. It's a huge privilege to say suicide is a selfish act. It's a huge privilege, and those people I am very envious of.
Are you, after hearing Fay's interview?
Am I envious of psychologically ordinary citizens?
Yes.
It's taken me many years to say absolutely not.
Yeah.
I used to be. I used to be terribly envious. I used to despise and loathe what I'd been through and what I felt I was going through. But now, and 2020 was a great year for this, I'm really grateful.
I still flip between, accepting how I am and the despising and loathing. I get into that despising and loathing myself and how I am quite easily. And it's something that I don't even notice happening until I'm halfway down the spiral and, half a day or a day will be gone and I've been like, oh, I've been in this really shitty headspace for a long time and I need something to, get me out of that or fall back on one of the strategies I've learnt to overcome that. Yeah.
Yeah, I am somewhere in, I'm not somewhere in between. I don't ever feel like I'm happy that I've gone through what I've gone through or I'm going through what I don't ever feel that. But I would like to one day, like if it results in something that's good, but it hasn't just yet. I mean, it's obviously gotten me into the field of work that I'm in, and I've helped a lot of people in that field of work. But I'm still very much like 80% would love to just wake up normal tomorrow.
Yep. Yeah, I'm like, if there was a magic button to, press and everything would be fine, I would press that without any hesitation, without really thinking of the consequences. I think I'm in Kaz's boat. I want to be at peace with it. So I think I'm on the journey to being at peace with it, but I feel like I'm at the start of it. And that there's a lot of stuff to go through to get there.
It is a hard one, actually. I mean, in even hearing that stuff, if I was to wave a magic wand and get rid of those experiences, part of me really would.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That is okay.
Absolutely.
Like, we don't have to love what we've gone through. I mean, we can be proud of what we've gone through. We can make use of it. But it's okay if you were just given the option, like, hey, come on, let's be normal, and just not normal, in quotation. Like,
let's be a pop.
Let's, not be in distress and just live a very ordinary, happy, simple life. I would take it. I would take it. Like, why could I not? I've never had that. Just for the sheer, experience, I would. How do they live like that? Just wake up every morning and they're just
Existential vortex, you know. I mean, I don't know the answer to this. I mean, I've got, on the one hand, when I hear that, I think, without stereotyping, maybe psychologically, when people are very mundane and they've got these kind of beige cardboard lives, is that what we'd aim for?
No, that's not what I imagine. Yeah. I'm imagining me as I am, but without an illness. I'm not imagining being somebody else.
What if you are as you are and you have no illness right now? You
the doctors would beg to differ. But like you, Chris, after your accident, I was told, you're not going to ever do a degree. Why don't you just stick to maybe a certificate to mental health at TAFE? Mm-hmm. And, I'm going to be starting my master's next year. So, fuck you.
That's amazing.
But you've done, how many degrees have you done?
I did 2 undergrad and I've done a postgrad as well. But yeah, I was told after the accident that I had enrolled in law and it was like, this career isn't for you. And it wasn't for me, but not because of the accident. But it was like, this isn't for you. You don't have the capability to do this anymore. So I had a head injury in the accident and it was like, you were this real high achiever, but after it, it's like, you are not a high achiever anymore because of this head injury, this brain injury. You are not a high achiever, and this has set you on a path where, life, your life is going to be very different and very hard. So, that's kind of the narrative that I was given when I was 18 and I just finished high school. That's kind of the narrative I've been living for half of my life. I'm 35 now.
Was there any evidence of that from your experience beyond what they told you? Did you start achieving poorly?
I passed my degrees. I found as things went on, I got worse and more distracted. And just this kind of talk became more of my identity, I guess. So for the first year after it was going on, I was able to, put it to one side and just do stuff and feel capable. But then there was a certain point when intrusive thoughts and things like that started happening. And then I'm like, oh, I am broken. Oh, I am fucked. I've got to go through with this legal case now. Because my brain's actually I'm done. Yeah.
That's a big statement. I'm done.
Yeah. I feel like that every day. Yeah. Like, I'm done. Yeah. This is it.
Still to this day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But 35, here I am. Yeah.
I absolutely relate to that. I mean, I spent so much of my life feeling I'm done. This is it.
But that interview that you did, it gave me full body chills. It was really good. It was really good.
Perfect.
It did to me too. Speaking to Fay, it really did to me. I was so excited and quite nervous, frankly. And by the end of it, really, really glad.
Thanks for listening to Club Mind. See you guys next time.
See ya.
See ya. Welcome to Out of the Box, where we look at things just a little bit out of the box.
Hello, my name is Caroline, and in today's Out of the Box, we will be discussing conversion therapy, or colloquially known as Pray the Gay Away, a systematic and often religious denial of homosexuality. It may be surprising to know that there are still thousands of programs in developed countries where they treat homosexuality as something that needs to be cured. Considering the fact homosexuality was only removed from the DSM and no longer considered a mental illness in 1973 and only became legal in most of Australia in 1994, it may be easier to understand that such programs still exist. Today, we'll be talking to someone who is a pioneer and worker in the mental health sector. He has chosen to remain anonymous for understandable reasons. So for the sake of an anonymity, we will call him John, because that's the most generic name I could think of. Thank you for joining us today, John.
No worries.
So let's start off with giving us a little bit of an explanation of what conversion therapy is and what's involved in the process.
Well, Caroline, it looks different for everyone. I can speak to what I experienced, but from what I know and stories I've heard and people I've met, it can include everything from shock therapy to deep therapy to literally praying the gay away and indoctrinating people with theology and beliefs that what they are isn't enough, that it's evil, it's wrong, it needs to be changed, that there's something inherently wrong with them. For me, it included a range of things from therapy to what they called prayer ministry, where a bunch of people would gather around, lay hands on me and pray that it would change. It would involve being sent to a 15-week course called Out of Egypt, where you pray about it and you watch a video about a guy in the Christian world who supposedly overcame his homosexuality and had a daughter, got married. And it's about praying, keeping each other accountable not to be lusting after men. It involved going to a camp where that stuff is prayed away and people talk about how it's wrong, to being given books after books about coming out of homosexuality.
So I'm going to take a guess that this wasn't your idea to send yourself there.
Well, yes and no. Some things were not. When I was 14 or 15 and I was going to a church, part of a youth group, I told one of the pastors about what was going on. He suggested I see a therapist, which he would drive me to on the back of his motorbike from Parramatta to Springwood.
Was this a psychologist, a psychotherapist? I mean, what kind of therapist was this?
It's a good question because I don't know. I mean, look, we're going back over 20 years and I don't know. I don't think that I thought about what the qualifications. I had so much trust in the pastor that I just went with it.
Of course, yeah, you're so young, you're not questioning someone's credentials.
No.
But I'm a little bit suspicious of this therapist and what their credentials were.
Well, I mean, I do now that I look back on reflection. And I suppose to answer your question a bit more, was it my choice? Some of it, I mean, I essentially I could have had a choice to say no to any of it. Like I really could have. But I was so indoctrinated and so, I mean, I came from a background of severe childhood trauma and not a very good home, that what I found in the church was like another family. And in this, I don't want to disparage the church and bag it out because for me, there was a lot of good things at that season of my life that it met. So out of that trust and wanting to belong, I easily believed there was something wrong with me. That was just an easy story or narrative for me to attach to and go, okay, what do I need to fix? I need to be better. I guess that's a long-winded answer, but it all was a choice. But was I influenced strongly? Yes, definitely.
Yeah, you were so young and you found a community in your church. So I guess, you were going off with what you were learning at the time.
Yeah.
With the whole conversion therapy and your experience with the church and being, taken to a therapist, how did it impact your mental health?
Oh, quite a lot. I mean, I guess the whole experience, knowing that I was attracted to men from a very young age, something I just always knew, and being in an environment where that is questioned or looked upon as something that is inherently wrong and needs changing, and in an environment where hetero marriages were celebrated and engagement, and of course I felt I didn't fit in, and because of the environment, all I wanted to do was fit in, belong, be loved, because I didn't feel that in my family. I just desperately wanted somewhere to belong, and I made friends. I actually had friends. I was I organised social things. So my whole identity was in that place. So I wanted to work so hard, but at the detriment to my health. I remember when I was 19, I drove my car. I tried to drive it into a pole because I was like, I can't obey this, but I don't want to live if I'm not going to, be able to obey God's, laws or whatever and fit in. So, obviously, I steered away from the pole at the last minute, hence why I'm here. But there was this darkness over me, this hiding, this feeling like I wasn't authentic. And it was a real struggle. And a lot of it I pushed down. I was very good at pushing it down until I came out of the church. And I guess it all just came up to the surface and, had almost a few little breakdowns after it because there was so much repression. And when you already don't feel you're enough, it's hard, and it's just you just feel like you're trying to be something. I remember going on dates with girls because I thought that was what I had to do. Was I attracted to them? No. Did I think they were pretty? Yes. Great personality, but I just tried to do the best I can.
So you mentioned childhood sexual assault, and you mentioned that you don't put down your homosexuality to that. Is that an idea that you were sold, that perhaps due to childhood sexual assault you...
Yeah, definitely that, and having a father leave at a young age and not being close to my stepdad and not having, all that kind of stuff. And I did believe it, to be honest. I did for a while think, oh, that must be why. And then I guess as I more and more met people that had, from their view, and I can only go off their truth, not experienced those things and were very close to their fathers. And then meeting people that had sexual abuse and were straight and heterosexual, if you want to put it in labels. So I guess that it didn't seem to add up to me as being a factor or having any truth to it.
You went through so much, and you've had close encounters with suicide attempts, and I'm so very grateful that you're still here with us today, and I'm sure so many people that you've helped along the way working in mental health don't even know how blessed they are that you did not go through with it. But do you feel that your experience with conversion therapy affects you to this day?
I think to a point, yes. Like, I've worked my ass off to work through that. There was a lot of anger when I left church because of what I'd experienced. I have mixed feelings because part of me, which is probably the more generous and gracious part of me, goes, well, they were ignorant. They only did what they thought was best in the light of what they knew. Like, I did what I thought. I was ignorant. I chose to go to these things because I thought there was something wrong with me. So am I any different to those people that led me down that path? I don't know. I still question that. I like to be generous, but it is hurtful. It is toxic. Yeah, I think it had profound effects on me. I suppose it just compounded other stuff that had happened in my childhood and just really reinforced a message of something's not good enough. And I can appreciate, even if somebody hadn't been through the childhood stuff, and having that message when faith meant a lot, that's what saved me, like, in so many ways. But it also came with other things, that some unintended consequences, which was this conversion stuff. There's something that needs to be changed. So I would be lying if I said there's still occasionally the doubt pops in, because it was so indoctrinated for so long and was part of my formative years from an adolescent onwards, when I was trying to identify with something. So yeah, it's still there. It's sad, and I hope that it's changing. I don't know that it will or if it has, but the way I look at it, even if a church genuinely believes that, I think they have a responsibility, to not put someone through something that is psychologically damaging.
Do you think there was a turning point, when you left the church, when you suddenly started to feel like my homosexuality is something that I can accept and celebrate? Was there a point in time when that happened?
It was actually a slow process. It was after coming out of a domestic violent relationship with another male that I met actually through the church I was going to at the time, funny enough. Well, I don't mean funny, haha, but strangely.
Ironic.
That I moved away from the church, moved out of the western suburbs, moved to the east, and had a bit of breathing room from it all. That really helped me, I guess, process and go on a journey of questioning my faith, what I believe, what it all is. Who am I now that I'm not going to church? Who am I that I'm no longer operating under this belief that something is inherently wrong with me because of my sexuality. But it was a process and a lot of therapy, a lot of soul searching, a lot of just time being away from those messages that condemn that part of me that I can't change. And at one point I really believed it would be healed, but it didn't. I was told things like, don't worry, God's got a wife for you.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I don't. That just upsets me.
Yeah. And I guess someone that's been in church and it's been an important part of their life, they might be able to appreciate how tough that is when something's such a foundation of your life. I imagine what it's like when someone's been in a cult, and I'm not saying the churches I went to were, and don't want to put anyone or anything down, but it's kind of a like that.
As someone who is influential in the mental health care sector, what would you say to people who are currently experiencing stigma towards their sexuality?
Wow, that's a big one, yes. It's a hard question in the fact that what works for one person may not work for another. I guess the big thing that helped me is separating yourself as much as possible, and I appreciate maybe not easy in certain circumstances, but from the source that generates the stigma, and that kind of fits if someone's belonging to a church or a religion or even a family that's not religious that believes that there's something wrong with it. So if it's at all possible, I think to give yourself space to process it. I'm not saying you have to forever, but for me, that's what worked, is actually getting some breathing space and be able to go. I wasn't leaving it to go, oh, stuff the church and stuff. Originally, it wasn't because I was like, oh, no, I don't believe that. It was like, okay, this is causing this part of this faith, this church, whatever, is causing so much anguish. So I need space from it to kind of process and understand and think about it and explore it and think about it myself. I hope that makes sense in terms of just getting that space. I mean, it sounds cliche, but most cliches have some truth, but therapy, and I'm not talking gay conversion,
Yes.
seeking probably a non-faith aligned, psychologist, if that fits, or a psychologist that isn't, indoctrinated to a specific way, because I think even just talking about it, it sounds so simple, but talking about it and finding a tribe, like finding people that get it. So one thing that happened when I left the church, I was fortunate enough to know about a group called Freedom to Be, and I don't know if they still exist, but it's a group that, well, it was a group at least for guys that had same-sex attraction, that had been in faith circles, so whether it be church, Judaism, Islam, that had that attraction but also didn't want to leave their faith. It was a really supportive group where religion or faith wasn't talked about, but there was that commonality. And I think with a lot of things, whether it comes to this or mental health, Caroline, I think a lot of the stigma and a lot of the pain and suffering comes from shame and comes from things being hidden, from feeling like you're the only one. And to touch on, like with my other mental health battles, when I've talked about it freely and found that the others had the same, boy, oh boy, it takes a lot of the power out of the shame of it, because you're like, oh, I'm not the only one. Oh, you get it. Like, it doesn't mean that everyone has the exact same journey, but there's this commonality and you feel you're not alone. And I know that sounds, well, I don't know if it sounds it, but it sounds a bit, I don't know, even saying, I'm thinking, does that sound all real, Pollyanna or very airy-fairy? But honestly, for me, those were the things that I would say helped, and I'm not saying everyone has the luxury to find all three, but that's all I can share is what's helped me. And hopefully it works for some people, because even if you're someone of faith or whatever, and I hope it isn't the case, but you come to the conclusion that you still think it's wrong, at least you've had the chance to kind of separate, think about it, and you've got that conviction made on your own, not from someone else's beliefs or not from because someone else has said it. But I do want to say a disclaimer on that: there is nothing wrong. We are who we are, in my view, and we're all created the way we are, and that's okay. And we're all, who the hell cares who we're attracted too.
Couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for chatting with us on It's a Minefield today. It has been a pleasure and an honour hearing your story.
Yeah, welcome. Glad to share it because even if it helps a small percentage someone, then, I'm happy I've I've shared it. But I just want to say I get it. Like to anyone listening, without sounding condescending or patronising, I get it. I've been through the prayer meetings, being shoved books and, having heteronormative stuff shoved in your face. I get it. And I get the shame, the stigma, the aloneness. But I just want to emphasize, you can't risk your mental health over it. It's too precious, your health, your mental health, than to be stuck in that stigma, that shame.
That's a great message, and I am sure that will resonate with some of our listeners and truly be an inspiration for some people out there that may be in the same position you were in all those years ago. Thank you, John.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandes,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager, with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.